All right, so we had a rain out today. So today's reading was done inside. And we're coming up on being about halfway through. You can see where I'm at right here, this kind of darker line. And I've read until I basically felt like the balloon was full, so to speak, like I actually sort of could see myself in the equation. And I feel like with most things, it's important to jump on the opportunity when it presents itself. And in that moment, I feel like you can sort of jump onto that idea and then go with it better than if you try to overthink something, I feel. So this portion of the book, we follow Aristotle as he has sort of risen through the ranks and become more favored by Plato. And he is doing basically his own teaching at this point. And we get to the point where the Macedonians are ill-favored by sort of some other portions of these Greek city-states because Philip is starting to try to bribe and, I guess, gain greater control over these city-states so he can sort of kind of wage his war against the Persians. And that's what's kind of going on at this point, where it's not necessarily about so much these ideas as it is the position of things that are at play. And I sort of came to the conclusion that at this point, it's like you're watching these very simple things occur. And I've used simplicity to describe art in a lot of ways because it's sort of something that I think can be scary, the idea of being criticized for who you are, because I think art is a reflection of your character as you try to define structure in basic space. And I think that it is something that is so primitive because it uses emotion and this idea of personality, where we try to derive meaning from something that is emotionless, I feel, because then it seems like it should be true beyond ourselves. And in that case, art is very primitive in using this emotion, but at the same point in time, it's like the point in which the future and the past can coincide, because it's this idea that anything can be there. And I'm going to sort of remove one layer away from this and then say that this is sort of where this art of oratory or oration or rhetoric or whatever it is that they refer to, this lens in which language describes things. And I feel like that's where it can be something in which it is very tough to speak. It is very tough to speak about yourself. And for people who don't have practice in regards to trying to dictate something that they can see and it's personal, and create this idea that is able to withstand perhaps the test of other people's minds, I think that speaking can be a very difficult thing at certain times, especially around those that you're not familiar with, or in front of many people for specific purposes. And in that way, I think that it can actually be sort of that same experience that art has, where it's a test. And I think that we're sort of watching these ideas kind of battle themselves out, where each of their steps basically works off of like a form of regression almost, as to where we can identify something with something else, basically. And I feel like that is sort of the initial steps of being able to divide things within your life and hold categories. And we're seeing a lot of that type of dialogue become present here in this part of the book, where we're getting down to the nature of certain things and attributes and what defines them, or which specific characteristics do we say a thing is more, and then unto which a thing itself basically relates to all things, which I sort of came to a different conclusion, because I like to almost oversimplify everything, because I think that to an extent, it is basically just this operation of creating a vision. And as soon as we have the ability to sort of almost become like stone, like we ourselves are something that is to be looked upon by things. And I think that there's a number of ways in which that occurs. And I think that in a lot of ways it's by sensory, and these sensations actually sort of overcome our being. And in that moment, we have a moment of reflection. And I think that that is perhaps the point in time in which everything almost becomes simplified. And that is, I think, the place in where something becomes interjected. And so basically the entire point of everything in the world, and they have their list of basically root causes, where they describe the different causes of things, and he describes beings and accidents and different sort of things, which are basically just descriptive factors for things that are inherent, or things that have sort of a notion of change to them, an unpredictable factor. And I sort of think that really it's the ultimate conclusion of all things to perhaps just share. And so I think that as soon as we get down the form of oration, or this rhetoric or dialogue, or of comedies that allows things to have this reflection, it actually allows something to feel true to itself. And I feel that the more a society gains sort of this idea of being able to understand these things and utilize them, then in a lot of ways we can sort of either elevate this idea and use it to create more descriptive factors for what it is that we're doing, or we can use it as perhaps something to put other ideas simply against. But then I think that an interjectory point of dialogue is basically a simple thing anyways. It's like the point of all things, which is to create, again, that idea of self-reflection. And then after that occurs, you can simplify something. And then so basically, in a lot of ways, I think they use the word phil, like in Latin. Something that's philic is obviously based on an attraction, and something that is phobic is based off of things which disperse from each other, or they repel, basically. Um, it is not something that you like. And philic is described to actually give you a sense that these things are basically cooperative, and they are, in a sense, symbiotic. They're dual natured for each other. And in a lot of ways, I kind of think philosophy actually really tries to understand things so much that what it does is it actually is a very, like, thieves aggressiveness. There's passive aggressiveness, right, where it's like somebody plays the victim, but in reality it's like they're sort of on the attack, right? And an example, of somebody being passive aggressive, is, let's say, you come across somebody who is in the streets and they're asking for water, right? And the way in which they basically ask for water is sort of like, well, you seem to have plenty of water. It's this idea that with their observation comes basically a motive. And people that do this a lot are sort of passive aggressive because they say that they're not being contentious, but it's sort of that the obvious wants and needs of the individual are possessed in their statements about something else. Well, you seem to get whatever you want. It's a passive aggressive kind of character. Now, when I'm talking about philosophy and I say that they're sort of like, they're not necessarily passive aggressive, but they are basically like a thief, which is to be very soft and subtle. And they describe other type of teachers in here, like the sophists and a few others and stuff like that. But I think that on the large, like the majority of them, especially at this time, language is very thieving, I feel like. And I feel like the root actual, like when Plato's talking about sort of this idea of philosophy being this very important type of thing because they're trying to save the school, and where I got to, he was sending Aristotle to go and debate because they're thinking about dismantling the schools and things like that, the Lyceum or whatever that they work at. And I think that philosophy is at its core kind of like thievery, because if we just take the world as it is, then everything kind of operates without thought. But as soon as we have sort of dialogue and language, which basically operates off of that self-reflective idea that I tell you of, it's basically an incentive for competition. Because then at that point in time, we understand separation of things. And we understand that in this idea, of trying to describe something, you basically do not acknowledge it. You don't acknowledge the thing, and in a lot of ways you sort of are turning it into stone in a lot of ways. And so by creating this sensory experience that allows the thing to maybe in effect, be sure of itself, the more aware of itself it is, the more that it's aware that life itself is a competition as well. And so I think that this sort of dialogue and rhetoric at its core is basically a basis for the idea of competition. Now, they don't necessarily bring that up, and they actually sort of downplay this idea of competition quite a bit in this book so far. But I think that philosophically you can come to a sort of treatise with competition as well, whether it's real or imaginary, varying in many different levels as to the way in which you state perhaps the right that you have as a thing to ascertain certain things, or basically the ability that, there really is nothing better that you could ever acquire than perhaps being singled out yourself through competition. And sort of in that state, then you can say that, well, if I find myself, then I've sort of found all things, because then I am one. And then in that statement, it's like there's nothing beyond you. And of course, there's varying levels of being able to, use dialogue, not necessarily in such a personal way. And it's like, does somebody take offense to me using a line of rhetoric or dialogue like that because it's very insane way of thinking, or is it because I'm not crediting anything else in my world? Both with a certain amount or time of thinking seem like they could be true, which is where I always come back to that. If your modes of thinking are along the right path anyways, they are going to basically, in a sense, be to where it could be considered as, personal and not personal at the same point in time. And I think, some of the other arguments that you can use are basically, to the extent of competition, if whoever the judge is, that is basically reflecting on your character, or in a sense, sort of like trying to go around you, which in a way kind of holds us where we are in place. The more something tries to go around us, I think that you can sort of, again, in a realistic way, turn the tables around and say, well, what can I do that you can personally put me into a situation where, I'm doing something that is supposedly for the betterment of where we are. And in most cases, that is actually beyond those people to put you in a respectable place. And then, so I think it's easy and quick to say, well, obviously this is a thing that is outside of even your control. And so I think that maybe you should be a little bit more grateful about your position and understand that the trials that everyone else is going through. And then I need to, and I am responsible for figuring out where it is that I need to go. But, and then you can basically put things to an ultimatum, like, I'm not going to do anything, even if I'm forced. And because I respect myself and I respect the fact that I'm not going to basically do something that I don't feel like actually emphasizes the character that I know I am. And, you know, if things work out where you find a position where it suits you well, then that's great. That's all well and good, right? But there's obviously, you know, there's the two extremes kind of right there. And, you know, one kind of rides off of this cognitive dissonance of the world in favor in the light of you being able to say that you are 100% comfortable with yourself and wherever you end up. And the other sort of putting it on the shoulders of everybody else to basically figure out what it is that you could do within respect to what you feel like you can do, you know. And if everything comes to sort of an odds, then just, you know, like either I'm going to be granted my ability to maintain my lifestyle, or things are going to be taken away from me. But that if that is the reality, then I think that nobody's really going to be able to stop you from ascertaining the other ability of saying that it is basically an opportunity for you to figure out who exactly you are and all those things. So as much as, you know, they philic and philosophy, you know, if you dissect the word or whatever, is this idea of sort of love. I think that it's like stealing, and maybe, you know what I mean. They say that stealing and art and a lot of that kind of goes hand in hand. You know, stealing somebody's heart, or stealing somebody's hand, sweeping them off their feet. I think it's a form of flattery, obviously, if you're well and good enough at being able to perform these artfully minded ways of basically stripping things from something enough to where that you can see the beauty of something, and then emphasizing that so that the object can see that. And I feel like this is sort of a performance that you can do with almost anything in practice and in theory. And so I sort of think that that is the root cause of all things, if I'm to oversimplify everything, rather than they're sort of defining the causes of things like at a much more individual level. I just think that it's easier to sort of say, well, basically everything is doing this is what it looks like, so I'm just going to say that. He also goes over some forms of like deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, and things like that, where it's like you come to conclusions based upon observations, and this idea that saying something based upon other things that are like that is sort of this idea of reasoning and such things. I think that in a lot of ways, you know, there's a lot of things that sort of, and here's kind of a question for you, that because there's like a lady talking to him and who's like cleaning one of their schools or something like that. And she's like, do you think that the sculptor saw or knew that Aphrodite was in the marble before he like sculpted it or whatever kind of thing, right? And I think in some ways, and I've expressed this before, that it's like this line that divides everything is sort of like it's sort of like and he gets into different descriptions. We get into different parts where it's like, this is what the different peoples believe. We're actually getting to that part, kind of like, oh, these people believe this, these people believe that. This is their story of creation and stuff like that. And I know I've sort of said before that it's like the line divides everything, you know, and it's as simple as expression as it is, like sort of as much as it is a complicated one, you know. And I think that it's kind of goes along with that idea of confidence that I stated the other day, where the more confident something is, the more that it opens up, which is, you know, how a straight line can actually sort of divide, almost like, you know, watching sort of these cellular divisions and things. But I kind of think that once everything is sort of one, then, and you know, it's like, and there's one thing. There's one thing and it's one. It basically is just like this operation which is sort of self-perpetuating, that I think, you know, is sort of that idea of play, of stealing something and giving it something back, but in the same sort of sentence. Because as much as something is one, then it's multiple things as well. And so maybe that's sort of like the origination of all things. There was one thing, and it was one, you know, and it's like that idea that, you know, vision and this idea of symmetry of all this stuff sort of, you know, kind of going through our meridian and all of these things that allows us to basically experience that one thing. And that one thing is the basically everything is everything. There was everything that was everything, and it was one. See, there's another way to put it. It sounds a little bit better, and it's I think in a lot of ways this philosophy too is making everything common. And I think I say that it's making everything common. It's not necessarily dividing things. I mean, we've already went over that, but as much as I can say philic, and as to love, you have to be able to sort of strip something. Then I feel like I can say as much as philosophy then unifies sort of things that are, you know, or that it divides things, that also unifies things. We must be able to understand. And for general purposes, time is what makes it so that we don't see everything at once like that. And it's time which basically kind of decides our conversations for us almost. As much as time is a chance, chance is also choice. Because if we were never given a chance, then it just insinuates that we were never given a choice, basically. And I say that it's making everything common. And I think that in a lot of ways, you know, if you're contrarian, if you're very agreeable, if you're lighthearted, if you're heavy and serious, you react to all these things in a lot of different ways. You know, maybe you're more like something, but it's time then that allows you to perhaps be comfortable with that, and not comfortable with it based upon the many interactions that all these things can have up to a certain point, right? And it's making all things common because it's that idea of everything being able to share, again, which I point to being basically the purpose of all things, is being able to interject, you know, sort of themselves into other things. And so I think that basically then, if I was to reduce it down again, I would say that philosophy is all it does is it's making things common. All it really is doing is making things common. And then so you can sort of play off all these ideas again, you know, when it is that you're coming across all these dialogues and all these sort of treatises and historical events and everything like that. Then you can see how all these characters, like, they're utilizing all of these facets over time, which allows you to, if you were to be interacting with them in some way, basically do this more effectively, right? And even if this is sort of not necessarily the ultimate truth of everything, it's an idea that it doesn't necessarily, it's almost like something you can't necessarily disprove for somebody, just like my saying, nobody can really make you not believe that, you know, having everything in the ultimate form of competition is believing in yourself. You know, and the more that you believe in yourself, the more that you're going to see that there's competition among you. As you then would begin to divide certain aspects of things and see that you are a being composed of competition. See, then it works basically just in all ways, sort of thing. Is like the ultimate goal here, to create something that basically works on those concepts and those precepts. I know there's probably more I could say about the commonality of things if I was to sort of close this off a little bit and sort of say why all things sort of become common. And I think it's because they have time. And as soon as anything experiences time, then basically what it means is something can always be approached with time. And really the only way that we can sort of even try to comprehend something that is abnormal is trying to understand this idea of things that are outside of time. These things that aren't connected by time at all. And it's funny enough, because I think that as soon as something has time, then what you're actually giving allotment to, and why time is maybe normal, is because it's the death of all things. And death is ultimately the most sort of normal and common thing that anybody can even express beyond a reasonable doubt between all forms of life or anything with emotion, is the idea that the emotion ceases to exist, which is ironically then that it's normal and provable and these other things. And so as soon as anything sort of experiences this time, then I think the funny thing about that is if all these things kind of work in, you know, this point of inflection that I've basically described before, is that then things can come to it in a different time. As soon as something does have time, then things are allowed to come to it at a different time, which basically makes all things normal, because then we've just divided time as well, as much as all things, and you know, then we say that each thing has a time, and then we recognize that there's multiple times, which then allows things to approach something at different times. And the more times we see something, obviously the more normal that it is. And so then that's basically how that operates. And so the most we can ever say is that about something that operates perhaps on wonder and, you know, beyond ourselves is going to be a simple answer, but then something we can't explain at the same time. I'll show you why. So basically we can say something like, the only reason that we think this is the way the world is because we don't know what is going to happen in the future. Perhaps everything we think of could be wrong, you know, but we think that maybe the only reason we think that is because it just basically hasn't, it's not expressed in our lifetimes. it's beyond death again. And we're reflecting back to that idea of the blank page, or of the silent tongue, the silent mind trying to say its first words kind of thing, and define itself and have to stick with its definitions, which is a scary moment, you know what I mean? Because it's purpose, just like death is purpose. So it's a scary moment, I feel like, for very young things that are very serious at the same time. And we say that, yeah, well, the only reason maybe the world is the way that it is, I mean, give it a chance. Maybe the only reason the way that the world is what it is because we just can't live long enough to see what's outside of our time. And then maybe that's just another person, maybe it's just another composition of these elements and emotions and all those things. But as much as then we could really never honestly know what exactly we are, then perhaps we could never really know ultimately what somebody else is as well. I mean, we can state all these things, and then we've created a question of all things, and maybe we can then say, at its core, there is perhaps something else, something that we missed. And the only way that, the only thing we can say is that we just don't have enough time to figure it out. And then maybe the only real way we can understand that is then we can say, like, time, like, what is time even? And play off sort of this idea that purpose itself, because ultimately time, I feel like I can just probably define it best as purpose, is that there's almost nothing more scary than purpose. And again, because maybe purpose is death, maybe it is that solidifying notion that maybe we really don't understand ourselves, but then maybe we're out of control. And maybe that is perhaps the most sort of amazing thing that we can say, actually. So that is what I read and what I thought about while I was reading my last little section. So now you have an idea as to what they think and an idea as to what I think. And I will see you guys in the next one. This is our third video about this book, but it's the second video about actually what the book is reading like. So third video in the series, but yeah. And I usually do this outside and whatever, but it was just, I just got caught in a downpour and had to basically warm up. It was like, just like a sudden chill, and like hell had opened up for just a moment and wanted to, freeze me to death kind of thing. So I had to go and kind of get out of the weather a little bit and make some impromptu sort of decisions there. But yeah, so maybe we don't understand anything, because ultimately there really is just no time at all.